Hi, Stephen Kent Mirasu. I am guilty in the past of having disdain is too strong a word, of preferring, having a preference for younger wines. When we first released our Cabernet, and our Cabernets are big and they're tannic, to the extent that they're big and tannic, given our winemaking style, I remember preferring those wines. I remember talking to a group of older wine lovers, my father's generation, and they were waxing rhapsodic about how great these older wines were in the tasting that we did 25 years ago. Excuse my French. And I didn't get it at the time. The older I have gotten, the more I realize how amazing older wines can be. There's something that happens kind of in the lifespan of Cabernet over time, Cabernet that's made well to begin with, that you trade in the ebullience of youth and the cocksureness of youth for more depth and more interest, more complexity. And two older vintages of Cabernet that we made for Stephen Kent are in our current flight, our current reserve flight at the tasting room. 2005 and 2011 Cabernet from Livermore. Both of these wines are showing absolutely phenomenally. I hadn't had the 05 for years prior to our club member appreciation party right around Christmas time, a little before Christmas. I've had the wine a couple of times since then. I'm actually having it right here. And the wine is absolutely gorgeous. It's lost some of its structure. It's lost some of its bigness. It's lost some of its tannin and kind of overt fruit. But what you get in its place is stropped leather, a sort of a story, a tale of time, a tale of the vintages that have preceded, or that have been, that have sort of been born of it, subsequent vintages, 2005. And it's beautiful to see how these wines evolve, how these wines become so interesting aromatically, and how interesting and beautiful they are from a flavor standpoint. The other wine, 2011 vintage, we'll talk a lot about that vintage because that's one of my favorites. But Stephen Kent, 2005, Livermore Valley Cab. And then 2011, all over the table. It's okay. Plastic table mat. 2011 Cab. Here, my cohort is laughing at me right now off camera. It's okay.
That's why we have a plastic tablecloth.
Indeed, and this happens all the time. I have paddles for hands, I think is really what it amounts to. Anyway, back to the wines. 05 was a cooler vintage in California. Yielded beautiful fruit. There wasn't any rain happening during harvest time that I remember. Unlike what's happening now, as we're recording this in January of 2023, and the biblical storms have just passed. 11, however, was one of those years like this past winter, where it rained all throughout the harvest. And we were actually picking cab as it was raining, trying to get fruit in, trying to pick between storms, trying to let the sort of vaunted or sort of ordinary regular winds that come through Livermore and make Livermore Valley such an amazing place to dry out the vineyards, to give us an opportunity to get back to some sunlight at the end of the year, jump our bricks up by a half a point or what have you. A lot of what became the wines of Stephen Kent in 11 were the absolute best that could be picked from the vineyard. A lot of stuff went into the garbage. A lot of stuff got declassified and sold off. The wines that we actually ended up making, the 11 Lineage, the 11 Premier, 11 Lineage, 11 Stephen Kent, Livermore Valley Cab, Home Ranch, were absolutely exquisite wines. They were very lean compared to most vintages from California, very austere to begin with. And that sense of linearity in the mouth, that sense of a wine with power and with tannin, but with very narrow kind of confines in the mouth from a feeling standpoint, have persisted even 20 years later, or 13 years later, and will persist 20 years later. I think these wines are built for age. These wines are absolutely gorgeous. The 11 has a gorgeous perfume to it, a lot of licorice. And what's more important than individual kind of tasting notes from these wines, which I don't like doing anyway. I find little interest in tasting notes at any point in time. For me, how these wines have evolved, the stories behind the harvest, I remember the mucky boots. I remember trying to get my two-wheel truck through the vineyards, especially Gilmedi, which at the upper end of the vineyard is mostly adobe, it seems, and getting stuck up against end posts as the car kind of slid off into the vineyard. It was a really challenging year, and it was a year that was derided by the wine press. The challenge there is the wine press is always trying to give you something new and something, the hot take of the moment. And the hot take of the moment, just like in 98, was it's a terrible vintage, it's cold, it's rainy, it's wet, blah, blah, blah. What you come to find though, when you live with these wines for a while, is that there was a gorgeousness to these wines. Took some time to get there. But there's an austerity to these wines that harkens back to what Bordeaux is and what Bordeaux has been for hundreds of years. Colder area, not as much sunlight, not as much raw kind of just California sunshine and forward fruit and these things that are gorgeous and delicious, but that to me tend to get overemphasized for the most part. So 11 is one of my personal favorites just from a drinking standpoint. I love this vintage. I love where it comes from. I love the story attached to the wine. There's from a winemaking standpoint, and I don't know whether this is psychologically where this comes from exactly, but it's always a beautiful thing to kind of work really hard to make something beautiful. And I don't know whether we maybe give ourselves an excuse for not making great wine in difficult years because it's difficult, and if we don't do a great job, we have an excuse because the weather wasn't great. But we worked our ass off in 11 to make beautiful wine, and I think that we have done that in a number of different iterations. It's the easy years that become more problematic, I think, in a way, because you let yourself off the hook in a way, or you don't think as much about how to make something that's really special and beautiful from a vintage that is, you roll out of bed, and if you can't make great wine, you should be doing something else, like 13, like 17, like 18, like 21. We those vintages are great vintages. Those vintages are going to end up being long-term, ageable, age-worthy, and beautiful, but they don't have the same emotional import for me as a winemaker, or for me from a personal experience standpoint. 05, really getting, I think, my arms around winemaking at that point in time. Had been running our winemaking program with Stephen Kent for a few years prior to that. Really, I think, getting to a beginning of an understanding about what we were trying to accomplish. Nowhere near the end of that understanding at this point in time. Every year is a different puzzle. Every year is a different challenge. And 05 was sort of the challenge of youth for me, of inexperience. The wines are showing beautifully. 05 has a bit more American oak in it than the 11, which has 0. We were really kind of evolving out of American oak into French oak completely by the 2009 vintage. So all of our wines passed from 09 onward, whether they were Syrah or Petit Syrah or Malbec, which had seen some bit of American oak, were all French oak after that. The cabs tended to be more French oak than American, although early on there was a smattering of American oak barrels, which gives you a different kind of texture, different notes of complexity. One of my favorite cabs in the world is Ridge Montebello. It's 100% American oak for the most part. Silver oak, which is not one of my favorites, but is the favorite of a lot of wine drinkers, is 100% American oak. So there's certainly a place for those barrels. We just like the lack of in-your-faceness that the American oak barrels that we use, or the French oak barrels that we use, give us. And American oak can be used for other people's wines. We have very small amounts of these wines left. The wines can be tasted in a flight at the winery. If you go to exploretalk.com/the Lineage Collection, you can get reservations for these flights. The wines are showing absolutely beautifully. Will show beautifully, I think, for the next 10 years at least for the 11, and probably for the next 5 years or so at least for the 2005. I think absolutely gorgeous wines. I think show what Livermore Valley can do. Show what we're able to do when we are being thoughtful and cognizant about what we have coming across the crush pad, and how these wines ought to be made. I hope you get a chance to try them. I look forward to talking with you about them. If you have any questions, always Stephen@winesaveslives.com. I hope you're enjoying the various ways of communicating about wine. And always, if you have questions, if you want us to talk about anything in particular, a certain vintage of wine, of certain variety, what have you, throw an email to us or a comment on Wine Saves Lives, and we'd love to talk more with you about it and them and those. Cheers. Drink something delicious. Treat yourself well. Treat your loved ones well. We'll see you soon.